Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend and I'm Marketing Operations here at Smarty. Today's webinar is about authenticating your APIs. We're going to give a bunch of helpful hints to make that easy and effective, and we're very excited to get started. However, before I introduce our presenter, let's go over just a couple of housekeeping items that we've all heard 10,000 times, but they're useful to keep in mind. This webinar will be recorded. We are going to email a copy of it out to everybody who registered. So if you have to step out early, so be it. You'll be able to get a recording of that to your email address, very likely later today, if not tomorrow. You can share that as well. It's not going to be password locked or anything. You can share this video with anybody that you think would benefit from the content. This webinar will be better if you participate, if you interact with us. So to interact with our presenter or others, please use the chat and the Q&A features inside of the Zoom interface. I think most of us know how to use that now, thanks to COVID and all of that fun stuff. And so we'll be taking your questions in your chat to try to make sure that we're giving you the webinar that you signed up for and that you wanted, and that you're getting the answers you need. All right, so the part we've all been waiting for today, our presenter is Kent Gividen. He is awesome. He's one of our developers and our developer team leads. So without further ado, I'll just turn the time over to you, Kent.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so today we're going to talk about authenticating to APIs, and there's kind of two pieces of that. We're going to talk a little bit about how to authenticate to some common APIs. Maybe you are creating an API, maybe you have an API that you want to authenticate to. So we're going to talk a little about some of those and different kinds of APIs and some of the tips that I use personally in what I'm doing. So some of these APIs, some of you are probably familiar with these. Nowadays, REST is probably, from an HTTP perspective, the more common API that most are using. REST can handle both XML and JSON and sometimes some other formats, but those are the most common. Hopefully, JSON is probably the most common now, and we'll get into a little bit of that. We'll spend some time with that. Some other APIs that I've dealt with over my career, and others probably have. SOAP used to be really popular, especially in the enterprise space. Some legacy APIs are in that realm, and they're traditionally XML with WSDLs that you can be able to use, and there's some utilities that help with that world. They are a little bit more robust, and there's some things about those that REST has solved. REST kind of came after SOAP. There's RPC APIs, obviously some proprietary APIs, and then you have things like socket APIs, like socket UI and things like that that provide some dynamic information. We are primarily going to, we'll hit a little bit on each of those, just a teeny bit. We're primarily going to focus on the REST APIs, since from an HTTP perspective, that's probably the most common nowadays. But if you have other questions about those others, we can talk about them as needed. Now, there's API and then there's like SDKs, and some people get these confused. So I just wanted to touch on this briefly. The API is usually the service that is being provided. So in our case, at Smarty, we have a number of APIs. We have the US Street Address API, we have the International Street Address API, we have Zip Code API, et cetera. And those are typically the services that we provide for customers to be able to interact with our products. And SDK is usually how you talk to that API, right? And there are some advantages to using the SDK versus going to the API raw. Some of those are the SDK is hopefully set up correctly to talk to that API with little code as necessary. So you have kind of a quick startup with that. A lot of times the SDKs are code specific. So you'll have a Golang SDK or a Java SDK or a C# SDK, and you can just add your keys and then be able to communicate a little bit quicker. Many times, and in our case with our SDKs also, they have features built into those. So when you're talking to an API, they might have multi-threading, be able to provide batch modes, some other things that you don't necessarily have to code from scratch. Our SDKs are available there at that link. If you go to smarty.com/doc/SDK, most of our SDKs are open source. And so you can take a look at the code and you can learn from those and learn how to, even if you don't want to use the SDK, you can learn how to authenticate and talk to the SDK or to the API via the SDK. and some of the strategies that we use. We cover most of the major languages, and so there's a good learning opportunity for those also. Now, one thing that people sometimes don't realize is that you can actually authenticate to APIs not using SDKs. So lots of services, AWS, Google Cloud, et cetera, they have SDKs available in many cases. And you can use those, and sometimes they give you power, and sometimes they just get in the way. Sometimes it would just be nicer to be able to access that API raw and be able to make the REST calls directly and not have to worry about the overhead sometimes that is provided from SDKs or methodologies that might not be applicable to your certain circumstance. So we're going to talk a little bit today about accessing the HTTP APIs raw and what that means and how that's done, mostly from a REST perspective. And so that gives you full control over accessing that API and being able to handle it however you want. You can implement multi-threading, batch modes, etc., however makes sense for your particular application. And some code bases just don't have, if you're using an off-the-shelf or an odd code base, you might not have an SDK available for you. And so this is another way to be able to access almost all code. Modern code languages have at least an HTTP a way of authenticating and communicating. So that's what we'll talk about a little bit today. There are a number of ways to authenticate APIs typically, and we're not going to be able to cover all of them. There are ways that you can, if you are providing an API, there are ways for you to secure and create that API so that's secure for your customers, or if you're trying to authenticate to an API that has been secured. A couple of these, there's more than this, but a couple of these are strategies that we use and have been using and will continue to use and move to look forward to using. Embedded keys is one of those. And this is more of a client-side key that you'll see a lot of times. And this is a key that will be, that you use on your client-side code. So that could be a web application, et cetera, mobile app that can then talk to the API. And we'll talk a little bit more about those and some of the advantages and disadvantages of those. Another common way are secret keys. You'll see this a lot in different APIs where you have, say, an authentication ID, and then you have a secret key that goes along with that, and you really want to keep that secret. That's you don't want to expose that. Another common way, especially now, is getting more popularity as the years go on, are OAuth APIs, and be able to authenticate those with OAuth. We're not going to be able to have the opportunity to deep dive into OAuth. There are a lot of resources available on OAuth for both creating a service that provides OAuth and also authenticating a service that has OAuth. And maybe that's a webinar we can do in the future. But that's also something that many people are either have implemented, going to implement, or looking to. We have now implemented OAuth on the client side to be able to log into your accounts. So now you can log in with OIDC credentials with Google and soon to be Microsoft, where you can use your accounts with those services to be able to log into our services without having to create a username and password, which provides a layer of security if you're already using those services. We still obviously support email and passwords, but that's an OAuth layer that is now provided by us. Things to consider with API authentication. So both from a server perspective and from a client perspective, if you're providing a service or if you want to connect to a service, obviously nowadays we definitely want to use HTTPS with modern TLS. On the latest versions, there have been some exploits on older versions of TLS, and TLS is usually the mechanism that's used to create that with the keys to encrypt those messages going back and forth for the requests. Other things that should be considered are things like rate limiting, so that you don't have denial of service attacks or other things that people try to do as far as making so many requests in a particular time. There are needs to throttle those, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Some other ways to create APIs and to authenticate APIs is that are becoming more common are nonce keys. Those are typically based for a specific amount of time. It creates a unique identifier that is typically based on the time that is happening at the moment, and so they expire. And there's various forms of this. In and those are used quite often in financial sectors and so on, crypto sectors and things like that. You'll see those where they're needed if you're attaching to their APIs, and that's becoming more and more common. And then, of course, another avenue to, if you're on the server side providing an API, you want to provide a secure API. And sometimes you don't have the facilities to do that, or you don't have HTTPS or user base or user and logins. And there are various ways that you can do that with proxy servers or authentication services. I've listed a few here. We're, again, not going to have time to go into a deep dive into each one of these. But there are things to look at. If you're providing an API to customers, you should probably make sure that it is secure. And some of these services are available to help you secure those, specifically proxies or authentication servers. So there are some that are available if you're providing an API to your customers. And those are some ideas. There are many out there. There are others and other open source ones and so on. But that will help you provide an API to your customer that is secure, that they can then use. Okay, so I do want to go into some tips and tricks and just some tools that I use personally. We're gonna go through each one of these a little bit. I'm going to actually use curl extensively for most of my authentications to the APIs that I talk to for various reasons. One, and we'll talk about that. Another good tool is Postman. Some of you might be familiar with that. Since there is so much documentation out there and so on about Postman and their great utility, I'll leave it to those to research that. But that'll provide a nice GUI within a browser that allows you to authenticate to APIs and use them and so on. One disadvantage of that is if you're dealing with only things on the console, if you have a headless box, it becomes a little bit difficult to use that sometimes unless you're manipulating your X screens and so on. So that's why I prefer to use curl, because I have particular services sometimes that I'm on a headless box with, and curl allows me to do that. If you're dealing with SOAP APIs, I'm sorry. Hopefully a lot of you aren't dealing with those anymore, but they're still pretty prevalent, especially in enterprise scenarios. SOAP UI is a tool that is very helpful. You can import your WSDLs that are usually provided by the SOAP APIs that will allow you to expand out to all the different calls. It'll allow you to do some testing, some connections to those. It's a very useful tool if you're dealing with SOAP APIs. We're not going to dive deep into that either, but just know that it's out there and that it's available and you can use it for if you're dealing with SOAP. And I highly recommend that. One thing to note that I see quite often actually is when you're dealing with keys specifically and other things, if you're dealing with code or scripts or whatever that are using the API keys, whether that's SDKs or anything. And I know that AWS deals with this a lot too, and Google Cloud and so on. Don't check those into any code resource. Plan on using environment variables or config files. And if you use config files, don't check those in. I know that at one point GitHub was auto-detecting if you had checked in your AWS keys because they had so many people doing it and it would strip them out. That's a definite security issue there, because those keys are then exposed to the world and anybody can use them and then they can hijack your account. So be very careful when you're using keys. That's probably my biggest tip today, is use environment variables that are then imported in your scripts. And you'll see that I've done that in some of these scripts that I'm going to show you, or use config files or some other method to secure those keys, and don't expose them to the world on your GitHub repositories or any other repositories. You want to hold those close to the vest so that they're not exposed when they are not intended to be for general consumption. I'm going to show you some shell and command line examples, and then also some scripts that we use that are helpful to test APIs and see their authentication mechanisms. So let's talk a little about some of these, a little bit more in depth of some of these API authentication mechanisms. So embedded keys. At Smarty, you can use an embedded key. Like I said earlier, this is primarily used for the client-side key. So these are not fully secure, and you need to be aware of that. If you're using any code that is sitting, whether it's in JavaScript or in HTML or wherever in the browser, that is exposed to a user. And it's pretty easy to get. You can right click on and go into the tools of Chrome or Safari or Internet Explorer, whatever, and see that code. So you have to be aware that if you're using embedded keys, you need to add some extra security measures. One of those is the refer, and you'll see this. Here's a curl statement that I'll show you, and we'll run this in just a second. And this is to one of our APIs, and we have a Smarty embedded key. Notice that on that key curl statement, I'm using an environment variable so that it's not exposed. So if I ever check this in or show it on a webinar, nobody can see my key. And then some of the parameters that go to the API, and then this refer tag with a specific IP address, which I actually didn't want to expose either. So I decided to use that with an environment variable. And then we'll talk about piping to JQ in a minute and what that means. So even with this, there are ways, so the refer is kind of the first level of defense as far as an attack vector is concerned. And in Smarty specifically, you can set up your embedded key like I have in the screenshot with this fake key here, and then you tie that key to a specific host or IP address. So it will not work if somebody tries to use this key from a specific IP address or different host. It won't work with that. And it'll actually give you a 401, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and I'll show you some examples of. Now, with that said, this still can be spoofed. There are ways to spoof refers and hosts. So you still have to be diligent on how you want to use these and be careful about that. So another mechanism, another mechanism, as I've noted here, is the embedded key can only be used in the get methods, not with post methods. The secret key combinations can be used in our particular scenario with get and post methods. And that's another layer that we've decided to do there so that you can't do extreme batching and things like that will use more searches than needed. So there's another mechanism we'll talk in a little bit about rate limiting, which is another way that we allow security on the embedded keys. And we'll touch on that in a minute. So another alternative are the secret keys, and other products use these also. And these typically have like an authentication ID along with them, with an auth token or a secret token. The auth ID isn't as critical to keep hidden, although it's also still a good idea. But the auth token for sure is your secret token, and it's called a secret token for a reason. That is something that you want to keep close and not share with the world. And so that auth token, again, using environment variables and things like that are a good idea with those. Okay, so let's move in, and we'll talk about some of these advantages to secret keys and so on. But I'm going to just show you some of these curl statements that are helpful. So we'll do a curl statement with embedded key just so you can get an idea of what this looks like. So here's my curl statement. If you notice, so curl, I'm just hitting the service. It happens to be our Smarty service, our US zip code API. You notice that I have the key right here, and I've exported it as an environment variable. And so that is not, no one on this webinar knows my key. Nobody knows what it is. And that's very useful. And then here are the parameters for what it is. And so this could be checked in to a code repository or something like that. And you're not going to have necessarily a security problem with this because there is no key exposed to the world. I also put an environment variable for my IP address. So I run this and I get back our standard response. I pipe it into JQ. I'll show you JQ in just a minute. It's just a handy utility when you're dealing with JSON and being able to parse and pretty print that JSON. So this is the return from that particular API. If I don't use, and then I'll give you another example here of a security key. So this is we talked about security keys. Again, I have the auth ID exported as an environment variable. I have the secret key exported as an environment variable. I have my license parameter, which we happen to use. And then I have some specific parameters that are used for our particular service. So if I use that, this gives us a little bit more robust information on exactly what was returned from the API in a nice format that's quick and fast and can be used in any terminal. If I don't use a key, one other thing I wanted to show you, actually. So right here, if you notice curl, I don't have the verbose in, it just returns the thing. One way to find out if your API is secure and what TLS it's using and so on is you use the -v command in curl. And this is helpful because then you'll be able to see what the TLS, you'll be able to see the path of this, and you'll see, okay, how is it offered? What HTTP is it going? What ports is it going through? Is it HTTPS? What TLS version is being used? And that's important, because if an API that you're authenticating to is using an old version of TLS, you should probably talk to them about starting to upgrade that and use newer versions of TLS. You can also see things like the actual headers that are being passed and so on, and you can see your HTTP code. So in this case, we have an HTTP 200, which means okay, we're good to go. And you can see the type of contents and so on that it's expecting. So there's a lot of information here, and you can see kind of the certificate chain as needed to make sure that it's secure going down the line. And there's a lot of information when you're looking at it from a security perspective that you can quickly provide really and provide that information that you can see fast if there are any surface level problems with TLS, or are they even using HTTPS, et cetera, and their certificates and that response. So I like that when I'm dealing with APIs that I'm not so sure. I want to check at least on the surface level of their particular security to make sure that they're up to date. And then in here, then you can see, okay, we returned this, and then it's nice. You can copy and paste this into whatever doc you need to, or take parts of it and dice it up. And there's some tricks with JQ that I'll show you in a minute that are very helpful also. But the -v verbose of curl is very helpful for that extra information. Okay, so here's what it looks like, and we can see, so oops, let me copy that better. In this particular curl command, you'll notice that, right? You'll notice that this came with an authentication required. Okay, so what's wrong with this particular request? Well, I know that, oh, hey, look, it's only got the auth token. It does not have an auth ID. So that's missing, and we got an error. But what error did we get? So again, I'm going to add this -v into this to see what it got. Well, our HTTPS and everything is all good. Our SSL connection is all good. But we got a 401. So that tells us, if you look up 401 HTTP, that tells us credentials required. And we also provide an extra message here as needed. But you don't always know that, depending on what vendor is sending back the errors. So it's nice to see this 401. It's nice to see the certificate chain coming down through and say, okay, their security is all good. But what error happened? And HTTP protocol will always return that error. So 200 is okay. 401 means credentials needed. There are other errors like 404s and 500s that you can look up. And these are standard HTTP errors used for the HTTP protocol. So again, curl just gives you a quick verification of being able to see this quickly and know what's happening. And I appreciate it, because I can do it from the command line on any Linux, Mac, or Windows service. Okay, so one thing I also did want to note in this, in the services, we've been talking a lot about JSON, but you can pass in an HTTP header called accept for application XML right here, this header. And if for some reason you are using XML, again, I'm sorry, although I've spent lots of my career dealing with XML, that will be the difference between passing in a header for JSON and one for XML. I have not put in a parser for the XML, so it's a little bit ugly here, but you can see that this is the same type of data, but with XML instead of JSON. But most modern APIs nowadays, I would say, are using JSON. It's becoming more and more the standard. XML used to be the standard, but I think less and less are using that, hopefully. JSON, especially with the advent of JavaScript and things like that with JSON parsers, it's JSON just is more popular. So there's that to look at. Okay, so we've talked a little about embedded and secret keys, and I've just noted some of the uses for embedded keys. If you're doing a web application or a mobile application, you don't want to use secret keys. You do want to use embedded keys because they provide the refer tag. They also provide some rate limiting so that if there is an attack vector happening, they can't do it over and over and over and over for the rates. And you'll actually start getting a rate limited code, which is a 400 error. And so that if you're doing, so the appropriate key for web applications or mobile applications is embedded key. The appropriate key for server-side environments, so that's if you're dealing with PHP, Java, Golang, Python, etc., or if you're implementing a authentication service, you might use a secret key also, depending on how that is implemented. Those should not be embedded or exposed. They don't necessarily have rate limiting, and they don't have the referrer tag that is associated with them for that HTTP request. So they don't have some of those limitations that the embedded keys have, but that means that you need to protect them a little bit closer and keep them closer at hand or underneath some sort of security, which also means you shouldn't check them into things like GitHub or probably any repository for that matter. And this applies to AWS, Google Cloud, Smarty, other services. You just want to keep those keys as close as possible for these Smarty keys, because they don't have that extra layer of security that embedded keys might have to be exposed to. Okay, I showed you on the curl statement, HD 401, that's authentication required. You can check the TLS versions and so on, and you get those errors that I showed you. So just pay attention to that when you're dealing with it. And again, in this case, we had the auth token, but we didn't have the auth ID, and you'll get a 401 either way if one of those is missing. So there are some scripts. Obviously, I like the command line. I use the command line a lot, just because it's fast, it's easy, it goes across platforms. I don't have to have a web browser. I don't have to have a application. It's pretty much on every single system there is. And so I use it a lot, but there are some things that make it life a little bit easier to test this. And so here's one of them. This is a script that I use quite often in Smarty. And it's a function that you can add to a bash or a Z shell. And what's nice about this is I can just type in SL and then any address. And there's some little fancy sed things that go in to replace this, and you can modify this as needed. But basically you have an address that goes in and it echoes out the parameter that was passed into SL. And I'll show you an example of this. And then it does some sed replacements for that to take it through, and you can pass in the addresses or the cities. And then it does a curl, again, using the environment variables right here. And then it'll return back an address. So the nice thing about this is you can just do SL space and an address, and it'll do all this fancy stuff and then do the curl for you. So again, let me go back to my, I'm just going to copy this address that I have here. So I can do quickly, I can do SL here, and bam, it's got that address. So I can test various addresses and my API with a quick, fast script that I'm doing over and over. So in my job, there's tons of addresses and I'm always looking at for different errors or whatever, trying to figure out what our APIs are doing. And so writing a couple of scripts that are not that complicated can help you be able to quickly iterate on your APIs. And that you can do it in a secure way. You can check this script in, you can share it. This was written by a colleague of mine, and I've modified it a little bit, but for my use case, but it's very handy. And so I can do things like, I can do that same type of thing, and that hit our live environment. But now if I want to go to our test environment that I'm dealing with, I can do this. That key is refused there, but, or a dev environment, I can go into there and see, okay, this works in a different environment. It just has a different IP address and host name and so on in that particular script. And so it allows me to be able to interact with those environments in a secure manner quickly. And so that's some little scripts like this are helpful when you're trying to test. JQ is something I highly recommend, and we'll wrap up with some of these utilities that I use. JQ, I like it. It's available on cross-platform. It's available on Linux, Windows, and Mac. And the nice thing about that, if you're dealing with JSON at all at the command line, it's a very, very handy utility, and you can script with it. So if you notice in this particular script, and you've seen me I pipe to JQ. And so if you pipe to JQ by default, it'll pretty print. So let me show you the difference between those. If I go and do it, so you've seen this a couple of times, but here's an example with JQ. Nice, pretty print. Lovely. Here's an example without JQ, with just the raw JSON. And so it looks very similar to that XML. JQ is also really handy. You can do things, it's a command line JSON processor. So you can do dot notation to extract particular items out of a JSON piece, etc. It also has filters. It is very powerful. It can do many things. So you can script up lots of things with JQ. I highly recommend you look at JQ if you're doing any sort of scripting or processing of JSON on your command lines. And we use it a lot. I use it heavily. And sometimes I have some specific test scripts that I like to run that I've created that I use JQ to figure out, does the JSON return this value or that value? And I can add filters and so on to it. So there's a quick overview of some of the things I like to use and how I check to see if the APIs are authenticated. I do use Postman once in a while, but again, I like curl just because it's faster. I'm more familiar with it. I have scripts that are around it. I mean, I'm very familiar with Postman too, but it's just slower as far as iterating and development for me. Curl just makes things a little bit faster, and I don't need the GUI. So that gives us high level, and I'll turn it back to Andrew for any questions that we might have through there. I know I blew through a lot of that.
You're going so fast with such good content. No questions, no comments. That or everybody's watching Netflix on their other screen right now.
It's hard to tell. I put everybody asleep.
It's hard to tell these days. If anybody here is not using Smarty or is in this webinar because you may be thinking about Smarty and you wanted to learn about the API and getting authenticated and everything, if you get a free trial, a free account of Smarty, it comes with 1,000 lookups, which is plenty if you want to set up the API and test it with those lookups. You can do that for free. You can grab a free account at smarty.com/signup. So yeah, thanks a lot, Kent. This is fantastic. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll go ahead and let you guys go. I'll be watching for this in the email. And thanks for joining us. See you guys next time.